Preparing for speaking tests. Well, before we begin, let's just remind ourselves about what makes successful communication. Well, to be a successful communicator, you need to know the code, the grammar, and the vocabulary. You need to have a linguistic competence. But knowing just the grammar and vocabulary doesn't make you a successful communicator. You've got to know how to put it together. You've got to know how to make sentences, discourse, blocks of meaning, paragraphs in written language, and so on. That's the strategic competence, knowing how to put the language together to achieve meaning. And finally, in order to be a successful communicator, you've got to have the psychophysiological competence. In other words, you've got to be able to produce the sounds that characterize the language and control the patterns of stress and intonation, and I guess also have the confidence to produce language successfully. So, what makes a successful communicator? Mastery of the linguistic, strategic, and psychophysiological competence. Okay, let's move on from what makes a successful communicator to assessing communication. Well, there are a number of words and a number of criteria, but let's just look at those put forward by Cambridge English. For Cambridge English, we assess language according to grammar and lexis, discourse management, in other words, the extent, the coherence, the overall meaning, and the cohesion, the way the language is linked, pronunciation, and interactive communication. Interactive communication, the way we initiate, respond, and develop a conversation. If we just take a moment, we can see that although the words that we've just been talking about are very different, competencies and different criteria, we can see there's a bit of an overlap. In fact, there is a complete overlap. What makes a successful communicator? The linguistic competence, and the linguistic competence is clearly the grammatical and lexical resource. What makes a successful communicator? It's the strategic competence, and the strategic competence is not only the way we manage the discourse, but also the way we manage the interaction. And what makes a successful communicator? Finally, the psychophysiological competence, well, that's clearly and directly related to the sounds that we make, in other words, the pronunciation. Okay, let's move on to the more practical part of this talk. And what we're going to look at are the four different task types that characterize some very common English language speaking tests. And those four task types are the familiar questions, which very often start an exam, the long turn in which a candidate may speak for a minute or two on his or her own, a collaborative activity in where candidates in paired examinations talk together, and finally, the discussion in which they or we share opinions. So, first and foremost, let's talk about those familiar questions. Now, I'm not going to talk about these tasks in terms of the language that you need or the sounds that you need to make. I'm going to talk about the tasks in terms of the strategies. So, what is the purpose of a familiar question? Well, it's to get to know you. And when we want to get to know someone, we ask questions which are essentially non-threatening, and we expect a kind of answer. Not an overtly long or boring answer, but not a brief or abrupt answer, which would show that we're not interested. In essence, we don't want a long answer, we don't want a short answer. We want an answer which has, well, three pieces of information. Where are you from? Well, I'm from Buckley. It's a small town in Wales, and I've given you there three pieces of information. Buckley, a shore, small town in Wales. And the whole idea of giving three pieces of information is to give my partner, the question asker, the listener in this case, something from which he or she can extend. Now, it's not just a matter of giving three pieces of information, because clearly when I ask somebody about their family, although I could say I've got a mother and a father and a dog, those pieces of information are not really relevant or appropriate. They're not really relevant because they're already understood. I mean, it's fairly easy for me to guess that somebody has a mother or a father. And the relevance of a dog is not quite as well, it's a little hard to justify. So, what kind of things should we say? Well, apart from three things, they should be things which are unpredictable, but also appropriate. Okay, let's move on now to the second test that we want to talk about, And that's the long turn. In other words, the candidates have an opportunity to speak for a minute or two about a picture prompt or a text prompt or both. Now, here I think there are two techniques to bear in mind. I think first and foremost, when you look at a picture, of course you can talk about what you can see, but very often when you talk about what you can see, sooner or later you will run out of things to describe. What you've got to remember is that the picture has a frame. It has a frame which has a beginning and a frame which has an end. It has a past and it has a present. So if you look at the young lady here, she's obviously sitting in a library, she's studying, she's preparing a piece of work. What has happened before? Well, I guess she's attended some lectures. She's obviously a university student. She must have studied hard to get into university. Maybe this is the first year or the second year. And maybe she's had a conversation with her tutor and now she's doing some research. And what's going to happen next? Well, she's obviously going to finish her assignment. She's going to prepare it, print it out, hand it in, and wait for her marks. It might be a very tense period for her. So when you see a picture, rather than just talking about what you can see, talk about what has happened and what will happen. That gives it a context, that gives it a story, and it also demonstrates a range of language. Another way of talking about a picture or a prompt is to think about four words beginning with E. Explain, exemplify, entertain, and emotions. Now, with the picture here, you can explain what you can see. Well, you can see a student in a library. And then you can exemplify it in terms of examples that are familiar to you. So, for example, okay, there are a lot of students, a lot of young people go to universities nowadays. Why do they go to universities? Well, they want to get different skills. They want to train up for different professions. Maybe they want to avoid unemployment and so on. She's preparing for a better life. Now you can entertain people. You can tell them a personal story. Well, I remember when I was a university student some 30 years ago, I had a great time. And to be quite honest, I rarely went to the library. And then you can talk about your feelings. You know, I really miss those university days. I was carefree, I was independent, and I was fearless. I guess the point here is don't just wait for the picture. Approach the picture or the prompt with a strategy. And this strategy can be a time-based one. In other words, the picture has a present, a past, and a future. But it also can be an E-based one. Explain what you can see, give further examples of it, entertain with a personal story, and then tell the listener, tell the examiner how you feel about the experience in the picture. Okay, we go on to the third task now, and that's the collaborative task. And remember, in the collaborative task, what happens here is that the candidates have to agree on something or disagree on something. Now, when you disagree on something, it's not natural that you would change the topic. What do I mean? Is if you don't agree on the best item for a birthday party, what you would tend to do is you would try to persuade your partner about why you think your choice is the best choice. I mean, if I wanted to go to the cinema tonight and you didn't want to, you wanted to stay at home, I wouldn't give up immediately. I'd probably try to get you interested in the film, tell you why it's worth watching, encourage you to come out for a drink before or maybe even after. So if you don't agree with your partner about something, or if your partner doesn't agree with you, try to persuade them. Now, when you agree on a topic, that isn't the end of the conversation. Because if we do agree to go to the cinema tonight, then obviously we're going to have another discussion about the cinema. We're going to talk about the film. What time are we going to meet? Which cinema are we going to go to? How are we going to get there? What are we going to do before? What are we going to do after? So if we agree, we explore the topic. Here are the 2 points then for that collaborative activity. If you agree, explore the topic. And if you disagree, try to persuade the person to come to your place, or to come to your point of view, I should say. Now, finally, the final task that we want to talk about today is this task of, well, discussion. And in discussion, or in the when people are asked discussion questions, they're being asked to express an opinion. Now, it's here that we really need to teach our students what an opinion is. An opinion is not just a sentence which is framed in my opinion or I believe. No, an opinion has 3 parts. First of all, there's a statement. Liverpool is the best football club in the United Kingdom. That's a statement. And then there is some shared evidence, something which can't be disputed. We have won 20 league championships. Or is it 19? I don't remember. And then there is a personal feeling. I think we play some of the most beautiful football that I've ever seen this year. So, what we really need to do when we're asking our students or when we're training our students to share their opinions and respond to these discussion questions is to train them to think one, two, three. Statement, shared knowledge, something with which you can't disagree, and then a personal feeling, a personal anecdote, or a personal truth. That way, you convince the person who's listening to you that your opinion is right, and they're more than likely to agree with you. Okay, I hope these tips have been useful. Thank you very, very much.